Camping has its own silence. Not the gentle quiet of a neighborhood where you can still hear a car in the distance or the buzz of an air conditioner. The silence of the woods is different, heavier. It feels like the world is holding its breath, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the cry of an owl, lands sharper than it should. Daniel camped because he loved that silence, but after one autumn trip into the mountains, he couldn't bear to hear silence again. He parked his car near a ranger station, signed the logbook, and hiked 2 miles into the forest. The trail was steep, the pines pressing in tight on either side. By the time he reached the creek where he planned to camp, the sun was already burning orange across the ridge. He pitched his tent, built a fire, and ate beans out of a can, watching stars come out. The night was cool, the kind that makes the forest smell of pine sap and damp soil. At first it was peaceful. Then near midnight came the sound, a whistle. 4 notes, slow and deliberate. Daniel froze, spoon halfway to his mouth. The sound drifted through the pines, sharp enough to rise above the creek's murmur. He waited. The tune came again. Exactly the same 4 notes. Someone was out there. He grabbed his flashlight, heart thudding, and shone it across the tree line. Only endless trunks stared back. His fire popped and spat, shadows leaping. The whistle stopped. Silence returned. He shook his head, laughed nervously, told himself it was just wind through the branches. But when he finally lay down in his tent, it took hours for sleep to come. The next night, the whistling returned. Daniel had spent the day fishing and walking the trails. By evening, he was tired, certain exhaustion would knock him out. But as the fire burned low and he stared into the embers, the 4 notes drifted out again. Closer. He stood, flashlight sweeping the dark. Nothing. "Hello!" he shouted, voice cracking. "Who's there?" No answer. Only the whistle. Long, slow, patient. The next morning, Daniel searched. He walked the creek, checked the undergrowth, scanned the trail. No footprints. No broken branches. No sign of life at all. By noon, he convinced himself it had to be another camper. Sound carried strangely in the woods. Maybe there was a group camped across the ridge. That night, he would learn the truth. The 3rd night, the whistle circled his camp. It started on the left, then behind him, then across the creek. Each time, the same 4 notes. Daniel's skin prickled. He gripped his flashlight so tight his knuckles hurt. "Stop it!" he shouted. His voice cracked in the heavy dark. The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, right outside his tent, the 4 notes played one last time. Daniel's chest locked. He lunged forward, unzipping the flap and thrusting the flashlight beam outside. Nothing, only trees. And yet the sound had been close enough that he could have sworn someone had been standing just inches from the tent wall. He didn't sleep. He sat upright, knife in his lap, flashlight beam jerking across the thin nylon walls of the tent. Every rustle, every snap of a twig sent his pulse racing. When dawn finally came, he was pale, trembling, his eyes gritty from lack of sleep. He decided he would leave, but something made him hesitate. Pride, maybe. Anger. He told himself he wasn't about to be scared off by some prankster in the woods. He gave it one more night. That evening, as he gathered firewood, he noticed something new. Carvings. On the trunk of a pine just outside camp, 3 small slashes formed a crude symbol, a circle with a line through it. He frowned. He hadn't seen it before. He walked farther, searching tree after tree.
More symbols.
Some were faint, others freshly cut, bark curling at the edges. All the same circle and line design, and as he stood staring at them, the whistle began. 4 notes. Low, patient. This time in broad daylight. Daniel ran back to camp, heart hammering. He packed his gear, shoving supplies into his bag. He told himself he'd leave immediately. But when he reached the trailhead, he froze. Pinned to a tree at the fork in the path was something small, a feather tied to twine dangling in the breeze, and carved beneath it, deep into the bark, was the same circle with line symbol. The whistle floated through the trees. Closer. Daniel bolted back to his car. When he told the ranger what happened, the man listened quietly. Then he said, "No one's permitted to camp that far out this week. Trails closed." Daniel frowned. "Then who?" The ranger cut him off. "People report strange sounds up there, whistling, carving. Some say it's wind in the pines, others." He trailed off, eyes narrowing. "They call it the Watcher." Daniel laughed nervously, tried to brush it off, but the ranger didn't smile. That was 2 years ago. He hasn't been camping since. But sometimes in his apartment, window cracked at night, he swears he hears it. 4 notes. Slow, deliberate. Carrying up from the street, as though the Watcher has followed him out of the woods. The wilderness has rules. Some of them you read in guidebooks. Don't leave trash behind. Don't keep food in your tent. Always respect wildlife. But the older rules, the ones whispered between hikers and rangers, are different. Rules like, if you see someone in the woods at night, don't approach them. Ethan and his friends didn't know that rule, and by the time they learned, it was already too late. There were 4 of them: Ethan, his younger brother Kyle, and their 2 college friends, Marcus and Josh. They wanted one last trip before autumn shut the forest down. The hike was long but rewarding. The trail wound deep into the pines where the air smelled of sap and earth. By late afternoon, they found the perfect spot, a wide bend in a rushing river, where the trees opened into a natural clearing. They pitched 2 tents, gathered wood, and built a fire that crackled high into the darkening sky. The first night was everything they'd hoped for: smoky sausages on sticks, cheap beer, and stories that had them laughing until their stomachs hurt. The woods were alive with night sounds, but the river made them feel safe. Until Marcus stopped laughing and pointed. "Guys, who's that?" At the edge of their firelight, crouched by the river, was a man. He wasn't moving toward them, wasn't fishing. He just sat on his haunches, hands in the black current as if washing something. He hadn't made a sound when he arrived. None of them had seen him come. "Hey!" Kyle called, a little too loudly. "You all right, man?" The man didn't answer, didn't even flinch. His head stayed bowed, hands sunk in the water. The campers stared at one another, unease settling in their stomachs. "Probably drunk," Marcus whispered. "Or homeless," Josh muttered. "Let him be." But Ethan couldn't. Something about the figure gnawed at him. He stood, flashlight beam jittering across the water. "Sir, do you need help?" The light revealed pale hands, fingernails black with dirt. The man wasn't washing them. He was clawing at the riverbed, digging between the rocks. Ethan's throat went dry. He stepped back. "Forget it," he muttered, forcing a laugh. "Let's just go to bed." They left the man crouched there, hands in the water, and crawled into their tents. But Ethan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard splashing. Not constant, not like the river, but deliberate. Slow steps pacing up and down the bank. Once, curiosity got the better of him. He peeked out through the zipper. The man was still there. Only now he was standing, facing their campfire, watching. At dawn, the riverbank was empty. They tried to laugh it off over breakfast, but when they went to refill their bottles, all laughter died. Footprints, circling their tents. Bare feet pressed deep into the mud, as though someone had walked around and around their camp while they slept. No one said much that morning. They busied themselves with fishing, hiking, anything to ignore the dread pressing into their thoughts. But as night fell, unease crept back in. The second night they saw him again. Not crouched this time, standing across the river just barely visible between the trees, watching. Kyle cursed, hurled a rock. It splashed into the current, ripples spreading wide. When they looked up, the man was gone. They built the fire higher, forcing nervous laughter. But the moment they crawled into their tents, the sound started again. Splash. Slow footsteps moving along the water, then circling, dragging, as though a hand trailed lazily through the river while pacing their camp. When dawn came, Josh was gone. His tent was unzipped, his pack and shoes still inside. But no Josh. They tore through the woods shouting his name. Their voices bounced off the trees, but no answer came. Then Ethan spotted something on the bank. Footprints. Wet, leading down into the river. And out in the current, maybe 50 feet away, someone crouched, clawing at the riverbed. Ethan's stomach turned. His flashlight beam trembled across the water. The man looked like Josh. Panic gripped them. They called, screamed, but the figure didn't turn, didn't move, just clawed at the riverbed with pale, mud-streaked hands. Terrified, they retreated to camp, hastily shoving gear into their packs. That's when Ethan noticed something strange nailed to a tree just above camp, a small bundle of feathers bound with twine, and carved deep into the bark beneath it, a circle with a line through it. None of them had carved it, and it hadn't been there yesterday. They abandoned everything but the essentials and hiked hard toward the trailhead. Every few minutes, Ethan glanced back, and just once, he saw him, the man, standing on the far bank, watching them go, dripping. Hours later, when they reached the ranger station, Ethan tried to explain. He stammered about the man, the footprints, Josh vanishing into the river. The ranger listened in silence. When Ethan finished, the man finally spoke. That part of the forest is closed this season. Ethan blinked. Closed? We didn't see any signs. The ranger's jaw tightened. That's because people keep tearing them down. They don't want to believe the stories. What stories? The ranger's eyes darkened. About the man in the river. They say he takes people, makes them his own. If you see him, you don't approach, you don't speak, you just leave. Ethan laughed nervously, waiting for the ranger to crack a smile. But the man didn't. Ethan never camped again. But sometimes when he turns on his faucet at home, he swears he hears it. Not just splashing, but a faint, low voice whispering under the water, calling his name. Campsites are supposed to be noisy places. Even in the wilderness, you expect people. The muffled laughter of friends around a fire. The zip of tents opening and closing. Boots crunching over leaves as someone collects more wood. Even if you don't see them, you hear them. That's what Ethan, Claire, and Miguel thought when they stumbled across a campsite deep in the woods. But this one wasn't noisy. It wasn't anything at all. And that silence still wakes Ethan in the middle of the night. The three had been hiking longer than planned. They'd set out to follow a ridge trail, but by late afternoon, the path had split in confusing ways. The sun was already bleeding orange across the treetops. They knew they had to find a place before dark. Then they smelled it. Smoke. Not fresh, but lingering. The sharp, earthy smell of a recently burned fire. They followed it through the trees and found a clearing. And in that clearing, a campsite. 2 tents stood side by side. A fire pit smoldered faintly, gray ashes glowing like someone had just doused it. A cooler leaned open. A lantern sat half buried in the grass. It looked lived in, but no one was there. At first, they felt relieved. Other campers meant safety. They called out expecting someone to step from the trees, but no one answered. Miguel checked the tents. Both zipped shut. He crouched, tugged one open. Inside lay sleeping bags rolled out neatly. A backpack, half open. A pair of boots with socks stuffed inside them. Even a paperback novel, pages bent, waiting to be finished. Everything you'd expect of campers, except the campers themselves. Claire examined the fire pit. The ashes were still warm. She brushed her fingers through the dust and pulled back quickly. It burned. "Whoever was here," she whispered, "they just left." But there were no voices, no footsteps, not even a distant cough or laugh. The clearing was silent, too silent. They circled the perimeter. No footprints leading away, no tire tracks, no broken branches that might suggest someone had left in a hurry. It was as though the group had simply vanished into thin air. Ethan felt a tightness in his stomach. "I don't like this. Let's move on." But the light was failing, the forest already thick with shadow. The clearing was flat, safe, and open. Against their instincts, they set up their own tent at the far end, as far from the other camp as possible. They tried not to look at the empty tents across from them. That night, the unease grew. The forest should have been alive with sound, crickets, owls, the river in the distance. But the woods pressed in around them, muffled and heavy. They sat by their fire, conversation thin and nervous. Then Ethan heard it. A zipper. Slow, deliberate, coming from across the clearing. The three froze, staring into the dark. The other tents loomed, pale shapes in the faint glow of their fire. Fabric shifted, as though someone inside was crawling out. But when Ethan shone his flashlight, both tents were zipped closed, unmoving. They retreated to their own shelter, fire crackling low outside. Hours dragged by. Then came the footsteps. Soft, bare, circling. Ethan held his breath as the sound moved slowly around their tent. Claire gripped his arm so hard her nails dug into his skin. The steps paused. Whispers followed. Too soft to understand, but layered, overlapping, like several voices speaking at once just beyond the thin nylon walls. Miguel hissed, "Don't move, don't answer." The voices swelled, rising and falling, words that weren't quite words. Then, just as suddenly, they faded. The clearing went still again. When dawn came, Ethan unzipped the tent with shaking hands. The other campsite was gone. Not collapsed, not abandoned. Gone. The fire pit cold, the lantern missing, the cooler vanished. Even the ground where the tents had stood looked undisturbed, as though nothing had ever been there. Claire swore she smelled smoke still lingering in the air. They packed quickly, desperate to leave. But as Ethan slung on his pack, something caught his eye. Pinned to a tree at the edge of the clearing was a photograph. Weathered, curled at the edges. It showed 3 people sitting in front of a tent. Their faces were blurred, but the outline of the camp was unmistakable. And behind them, in the shadows, 3 other figures stood. Tall, motionless, watching. Ethan's stomach dropped. Claire whispered, "Those look like us." They didn't argue. They hiked out without stopping, barely speaking the entire way. But weeks later, when Ethan developed the rest of the photos from their trip, one made his blood run cold. It was a shot of the clearing taken just before nightfall. Their tent stood in the background. But in the foreground, by the vanished camp, 3 dark shapes stood again. This time their faces were clear, and they were smiling. Trails don't usually trick you. They might be hard to follow. They might test your endurance, but they go somewhere. A lookout, a stream, another trail. Ethan and Marissa knew this. They were seasoned hikers, the kind who carried extra batteries, compass, paper maps, and even backup rations. They prided themselves on never getting lost. But that was before they found the trail that didn't lead anywhere. It only led back to itself. The first day of their trip was picture perfect. They hiked to a clearing by a bubbling stream, pitched their tent, and cooked dinner as the sunset turned the treetops red. The night was crisp and uneventful. On the second day, they decided to push deeper into the forest. They left camp mid-morning, planning to explore and return by evening. The trail wound uphill, through dense pines that grew so thick they formed a canopy, blotting out most of the sunlight. After an hour, they reached a fork. Left dipped down, right rose higher. They chose right. The trail climbed steeply, then dropped into a small clearing. At first it looked ordinary, a ring of stones, scattered branches. Then Ethan's stomach dropped. In the dirt, clear as day, were their own boot prints, exactly where they'd stepped earlier. Maybe it's a loop, Marissa said quickly, too quickly. Some trails are like that. But when they retraced their steps and took the left path instead, 20 minutes later, the trees opened into the same clearing, the same prints, the same stones. They tried again and again. For hours, they followed new directions, cut across ridges, even walked straight through the trees without a path. Every route ended at the same place. By afternoon, panic was setting in. Ethan carved a mark into a tree with his knife, a deep X. When they came back into the clearing, the mark was gone. He tried again, this time carving into 3 trees along the way. When they looped back, not only were the marks gone, but one tree looked freshly grown, the bark smooth and unscarred, as if it had never been touched. The forest seemed alive, and it was watching them. The silence thickened as the day bled into dusk. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, not even the wind through the branches. Only their footsteps. And then faintly whispers. At first Ethan thought it was Marissa mumbling, but when he asked, her pale face said otherwise. The whispers came from the trees. Low, layered. A dozen voices speaking at once, too soft to make out but urgent. Insistent. "Don't answer," Marissa whispered. Her hand gripped his so tight it hurt. The voices swelled anyway, circling them, drifting in and out of the pines. By nightfall, both were trembling. Their flashlights cut narrow beams through the dark. Then suddenly the trail opened again. The clearing. But this time they weren't alone. A figure stood at the far end. Tall, thin, head tilted unnaturally to one side. Ethan raised his light. For one flicker he thought it was a man, until he saw the face. Blank, smooth, no eyes, no mouth. The beam quivered, and the figure was gone. They ran, branches clawing at their clothes, whispers chasing them through the dark. Every path bent, twisted, dragged them back toward the same place. The clearing again, but now something waited. Their own tent. Only wrong. The fabric sagged, stained black, eaten through with mildew. Their backpacks lay crumpled, straps frayed, metal rusted, as if decades had passed. Marissa whimpered, "That's not ours." Ethan's light swept inside. 2 sleeping bags lay open. Inside, curled and brittle, were skeletons. Their skulls faced the entrance, grinning, waiting. They fled blindly, screaming into the endless dark. Hours later, a road worker found them staggering along a service path, hysterical, covered in scratches, babbling about the same trail and the voices. They never went back for their gear. But weeks later, a ranger hiked the area to check. He found nothing. No tent, no gear, no skeletons. Only a clearing. Empty. As though it had been waiting for its next visitors. The forest keeps things. Bones, ashes, secrets. But sometimes what it keeps doesn't want to stay buried. Alex learned that the night he dug a fire pit. He was a seasoned camper. Solitude was his escape, and he loved nothing more than hiking alone for days, with nothing but the sound of wind and water. That week-long trek had been planned for months. On his second night, he found a clearing ringed by crooked birch trees. The ground was soft, damp with pine needles, perfect for a fire. He dropped his pack, unrolled his gear, and began digging a shallow pit. The soil gave way too easily, almost loose as though it had already been disturbed. Then his shovel struck something soft. Not rock, not root. It yielded with a sickening give, tearing like old cloth. Alex frowned, crouched, and swept soil aside with his hands. A smell rose, foul, damp, rotting, and then he saw it. Pale skin, a cheek, a closed eye. A woman's face pressed into the earth, her lips cracked and blue, her hair tangled with twigs. Alex staggered back, bile burning his throat. It wasn't an animal, it was human. He fumbled for his phone, no signal. When he looked back, the face was gone. Just soil, smooth, untouched, as if he'd never dug at all. His shovel lay clean. He stood there shaking, whispering to himself that he was tired, that shadows were playing tricks. He forced himself to build a small fire anyway, cooked a meager dinner, and crawled into his tent. But that night he heard it. Scratching. Soft, circular, as if fingernails dragged through the earth just beneath him. It moved around his tent, slow, steady. And then came the voice, broken, whispering. "Please let me out." He sat upright, knife clutched, eyes wide in the dark. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, then faded. At dawn, the forest looked ordinary. But as he packed his gear, he saw it, faint impressions in the soil around his tent. Handprints. As if something had been crawling just under the surface all night. The third day was worse. No matter where he went, he saw signs. A patch of soil that shifted when he stepped on it, like something moving underneath. A birch tree peeled raw, bark hanging down in strips like torn fingernails. Once, when he knelt by the river to fill his bottle, he swore he saw a pale hand break the surface just downstream, reaching, grasping, before sinking back into the current without a ripple. By the time night fell, he was exhausted. He pitched his tent on a ridge, built a fire, and forced food down. That was when he smelled it again. Rotting soil. Damp, suffocating, as though the earth itself had turned inside out. And then he heard breathing. Not his own. Shallow, wet, coming from beneath the ground by the fire. He shone his flashlight and froze. The soil moved. It bulged upward. Something was pushing from below. The ground split and she emerged. The same woman, half buried, dragging herself from the dirt, soil clinging to her hair, hollow eyes fixed on him. Her mouth opened, spilling clumps of earth as she whispered, "You dug me up." Alex screamed, grabbed his pack, and ran. Branches tore his arms, roots caught his ankles. Still, he didn't stop. Behind him, he swore he heard the scratching again. Not from one place, but everywhere. Beneath his feet, in the trees, inside his head. By dawn, he collapsed onto a service road, filthy and half delirious. 2 hunters found him hours later. His lips trembled as he repeated the same words over and over. "There's a woman under the ground." The hunters let him out. When they asked where he had camped, he refused to point the way. A week later, rangers searched the forest. They found no disturbed soil, no shallow pit, no clearing with crooked birch trees. Nothing. But Alex never camped again. And at night, when he lies in bed, sometimes he hears it, faint scratching through the walls, closer every time. "Let me out." If you made it this far, thank you for spending your night with us. If these stories gave you chills, there's plenty more waiting. Don't forget to subscribe to Night Fear Stories for new terrifying tales every single night. Sleep well, if you can.